Welcome back to Face the Nation. We continue our conversation with authors whose new books explore leadership amid crisis. Robert Dallek is the author of Franklin D. Roosevelt, A Political Life. Ron Chernow is the author of Grant. Nancy Koehn is the author of Forged in Crisis. And Mark Updegrove is the author of The Last Republicans. Mark, I'll start with you on this question of what is your... You call your book The Last Republicans, not the Bush family or something. Why that title?
Well, because it was clear that the Bushes represent a last, the establishment Republican Party. Right now, we see a party at war with itself. You still have establishment members of that party, but there are insurgents who have taken over. And the party really doesn't stand for anything specific. There is no binding platform or principles. It's really what its standard bearer, the very capricious and unpredictable Donald Trump, decides it wants to be. So in some manner, the Bushes, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, represent the end to a type of republicanism.
Ron, why Grant? And was it the Grant when you went into the book is the same one as when you were finally done?
Well, yeah, you know, I have a contrarian streak to my nature, so whenever I feel that the stereotype of a particular historical figure has hardened into a caricature, I'm attracted to it. You know, so with Grant, I was interested really in retiring three chief myths about him. One, that he was a crude and brutal butcher as a general. In fact, he was a dazzling strategist. I wanted to retire the idea that he had somehow stumbled through the entire Civil War in an alcoholic haze. He did have a drinking problem, but he never drank during, much less before a battle. And I also, most importantly, wanted to change the image of his presidency from one that was completely dominated by corruption and cronyism to one that, in fact, had many elements of courage in terms of his effort to protect the 4 million former slaves, now full-fledged American citizens. And Grant hires a crusading attorney general named Amos Ackerman, uses the newly created Justice Department, and really crushes the Ku Klux Klan, which had taken over the South.
Robert, I want to, as we talk about presidential characteristics, one that strikes me about FDR was that sense of guile. And his lack of transparency. We talk about must be constantly truthful. He was pretty good at not always being truthful with everybody. Was that a key skill of his?
It was indeed. And in fact, you know, he would never say in public the kinds of things that he would say in private. For example, after he won in 1944, he disliked Tom Dewey, the opponent, and privately called him a son of a bitch. But he would never say that in public because he was someone who was very mindful of, he would be a half a step ahead of public opinion. And it gave him a sense of the country, a sense of leadership. And, you know, he was an extraordinary character. After all, he was a man who couldn't walk. And he only made one reference to his disability once in his entire presidency of 12 years. When he came back from Yalta, he said, "I know you will excuse me for sitting down, for I carry 10 pounds of steel around each of my lower limbs." It's the only time he ever made reference to the fact that he was, but what a story. Here's a man who was immobilized, couldn't walk, and he wrote a letter to to a congressman saying, when you get frustrated, you can get up and walk around. He said, "I'm stuck in this chair." And, but privately, he was always, you know, much more candid than he was publicly.
I'm struck by the picture in your book, the last one of him, where he looks like a man who has had to carry around a lot of weight in his entire life. Mark, let me ask you about the Bush Code. We were just talking about a letter that FDR wrote. I was struck by a letter that George Herbert Walker Bush wrote to his sons during Watergate. Tell us about that letter. And also, the father was always kind of taking whatever moment was happening and using it as a lesson for his sons, it felt like, about this Bush Code.
It was a primer of sorts. So George H.W. Bush, while he is the chairman of the Republican Party at the height of Watergate, 2 weeks before Richard Nixon resigns, writes a letter to his boys, he calls him his lads, talking about that moment and why it's important, how you stick by a friend in need. You don't go with the crowd. You don't join the mob if you don't have to. You stick by your principles and you reserve your judgment. One of the things he says in that is, understand that power accompanied by arrogance is very dangerous. It is particularly dangerous when men with no experience have it. for they can abuse our great institutions. And that's amazing because the first part of that is clearly about Richard Nixon, the arrogance and power. The last part of that is a hypothetical.
Yeah.
Somebody with no experience. Nixon clearly had experience. He had been a congressman, he had been a senator, he had been vice president. And so it's a hypothetical. And so it wasn't hard to infer what the Bush family felt about Donald Trump as he emerged as the clear man to beat in 2016.
Nancy, in your book, you talk about something called the gathering, which I want you to explain. But you also have, when you talk about leadership, people are grabbing it. In other words, they are not, there's this question always of greatness, is it thrust upon you or do you seize it? What's your take on that? And explain what you mean by gathering.
So I think that the man or the leader makes the moment as well as the moment making the leader. So Grant is transformed as a general over the course of the Civil War. FDR, right, is changed and developed through the course of his 4 terms.
Yes.
I'm sure this is true of both 41 and 43. So greatness is not thrust upon us in some kind of divine strike of lightning, right? Greatness is something that I think proceeds very significantly from one person's willingness to say, I want to get better, and to FDR, I'm going to show up in service to my mission with dignity, right, and humanity and compassion and a sense of the larger national interest. But that development, the ability of FDR to do that, the ability of Grant, right, to do such important things toward ensuring that the transformation of America in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment actually happened, that wasn't something that they downloaded an app for, John.
Yeah,
right?
But
they had to work at it. They had to, and they all had all these people had mileage with failure, right? Which I maintain is an important part of the making of resilient, courageous leaders.
Well, Ron, pick up exactly on that feeling with Grant and failure. I mean, I can think of so many instances where there was a failure, and not only does he say, lick 'em again at Shiloh after he loses, I think it's Shiloh, but also if he hadn't had his failure out west, he maybe never would have come back east and been in the position to be a hero.
Absolutely, and I think what happens, you know, he fails at one business after another before the Civil War. By the time the Civil War breaks out, he's almost 40. He's been reduced to working as a clerk in his father's leather goods store in Galena, where he's a clerk junior to his 2 younger brothers. Then the war breaks out 2 months later. He's a colonel. 4 months later, he's a brigadier general. 10 months later, he's a major general. And then 4 years later, he has 1 million soldiers under his command. But I think that pre-war experience of failure was extremely important because he learned how to weather adversity. It gave him a kind of toughness and perseverance that would be extremely important in a war that was very long, bloody, and protracted, and also gave him an audacity. He had nothing to lose and everything to gain. You see that at Shiloh, again and again, he takes colossal risks that no other Union general would have dared to take.
Yeah. Robert, we obviously with FDR there was the polio, and I was struck what you point out about him becoming an actor as a result of that. A key skill for a president.
Yes. He said to Orson Welles once, Orson, you and I are the 2 greatest actors in America. But, you know, he had a kind of self-confidence. And I think it develops, as you suggested, Nancy, as they go through the presidency and struggle with these crises. But Roosevelt's idea of the presidency was FDR in the White House, see, that he was the man to do the job. And of course, he had the example of his distant cousin Theodore, who had been a...
Talk about confidence, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
and Rio.
Right. And he came from a distinguished family. They were patricians, and it served him brilliantly.
But it's very clear that great leadership grows from deeply held values.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And that's so obvious in the case of both Grant and FDR.
And also, I think one thing important to emphasize at the moment is, you know, honesty. Grant, as president, was such a stickler for honesty that one day a visitor came to his office. You could just walk into the White House at that point. And Grant, in his office, hears the White House usher telling someone that the president is out of the office. Well, when the stranger leaves, Grant pops out of the office and says to the usher, he said, "You should have said that I was otherwise engaged." He said, "I don't lie for myself, and I don't like people lying for me."
You know, and Lincoln had the same sense of, you know, this kind of very high bar, right, on honesty. There's a wonderful line that he says to one of the quartermasters, you can't, when they're victualling the White House, providing beef to the White House, he said, you can't give me and my family the best choice cuts of meat when my soldiers, right, don't have socks and enough muskets. So the sense that the leader sets a standard, right, of honesty, of comportment, of dignity, and that people, the understanding on FDR's part, on Grant's part, on both the Bush president's part, that people take their cues from leaders, right? Not just kids, all kinds of people look to leaders for examples, for courage under pressure, for a sense of direction. So I think another element of leading in turbulent times, John, is the element of how leaders show up and in response to what values, Mark. It's really important.
An expression of that, Nancy, was in the fact that Franklin Roosevelt never stepped forward to support African Americans. He never worked to support an anti-lynching law. But the irony is that at the end of his administration, after 12 years, black voters had moved from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party and have remained there ever since. And Roosevelt, because of the New Deal programs, those alphabet agencies, they went down to the lowest level, so to speak, of the economy. And black voters felt that he was on their side. And you know, that wonderful anecdote about the industrial worker who said, Franklin Roosevelt was the only man in the White House who ever would have understood that my boss is a son of a bitch.
Mark, you mentioned earlier that the Iraq War was the one instance in which the son talked to the father. Incredibly close, and yet he didn't turn to him that much. Talk a little bit about that, the tightness of their bond, what that was founded on, but then also the fact that they kind of, he wasn't calling his father all the time for advice.
Nor was his father imposing his point of view on his son. And that goes back to the inherent humility of George H.W. Bush. He didn't want to be an added burden to his son. He didn't want to say, hey, Junior, here's how you can do things. He would also concede, as would George W. Bush say, that the world had changed since his father was president. I think he harbored some reservations about his son's policy in Iraq, but he didn't want to do anything to jeopardize the presidency. If I can make one point, though, John, Nancy talked about comportment. You can't underemphasize the importance of civility in times of great division. And one of the things that George W. Bush says in his inaugural address in 2001, when we were very divided after that election of 2000 was contested, he said, civility is not a tactic, it is a determined choice of trust over cynicism, community over chaos. We could live by that adage today.
You said it.
Ron, let me ask you about, these were solitary figures that we're all talking about, but they also had deep connections with other people. In the case of Grant, was it Sherman? I was just basically struck by their relationship. But then he also had, was it Rollins? Talk about that interplay with other people. These weren't just totally solitary.
There always has to be kind of a fearless truth teller on the staff. And what happens when Grant becomes Brigadier General, he invites a young lawyer from Galena named John Rollins onto his staff. And Rollins takes his position as adjutant, really chief of staff, on one condition, that Grant not touch a drop of liquor for the rest of the war, or he, Rollins, would call him on it. Well, alas, Grant fell off the wagon, many times, and Rollins privately called him on it, but not publicly, because he really felt that the fate of the Union rested on the shoulders of Ulysses S. Grant. So I think we owe a tremendous debt to John Rollins, who later became Secretary of War, for always having the courage to tell Grant what he needed to know.
Robert, of course, there's Eleanor Roosevelt.
That's right. Yeah. But he owed a great debt to Eleanor and to Harold Ickes, who was also a voice for the liberal side of his administration. He was a very careful politician. When it came to the Holocaust, for example, he saw the anti-Semitism in the country, the anti-immigrant sentiment, but Eleanor was so angry when Breckinridge Long, the Assistant Secretary of State, wouldn't let 80 Jewish refugees from Portugal into the country. And she went to Franklin and she said, this guy is a fascist. And Franklin said, you must not say that, Eleanor. And she said, but Franklin, it's true. And she was tough. and direct.
Nancy, finally to you. Rachel Carson is different than all these others.
She sure is.
And explain why she had to do kind of two jobs.
Right. So Rachel Carson is the only woman in my book, the environmentalist, who's environmental really builder, right? Who did more than any one person to found the modern environmental movement by publishing Silent Spring in 1962. So the fascinating thing about her story in the context of these other four very interesting, driven men, is that she's the primary caretaker for her birth family all her life, for her parents, for her sister and brother, then for her sister's kids, then for her sister's kids' kids. She's doing all that. She has a government job. She's trying to write a book, and in the late 1950s, she's battling breast cancer while she's adopted her grandnephew at the age of 50, and not sure she can beat the clock to finish a book that she knows is both dangerous and potentially really will rock the world. And so her story, a particularly female story, is a story of a very, very powerful kind of courage and grace in pursuit of something really important and decent.
All right, well, these are all wonderful books. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end our conversation there. We'll be right back with another author and another book, Walter Isaacson. We're joined now by Walter Isaacson, the author of a new book, Leonardo da Vinci, which explores the life and work of the original Renaissance man. All right, Walter, you were my boss. You always said that stories are at the heart of these things. So what story for you starts it with Leonardo?
I think when he turns that unnerving milestone of becoming 30 years old, and he's been, yeah, you and I remember that a bit, and he's been a painter moderately successful in Florence, but he has trouble finishing his paintings. And it's kind of worse because his father is a notary and has notarized some of the contracts of those paintings. So Leonardo decides it's time to seek new horizons. And so he's part of a delegation that goes from Florence to Milan, a cultural delegation, because that's how Florence had its influence. You know, it didn't have a great military, it kept losing to Pisa, but you know, they would send its architects and artists to other cities, and so Florence became, you know, what Joe and I would call soft power. And so he goes there, and he goes as a musician, because he's invented a lot of musical instruments, but when he gets to Milan, he doesn't want to go home. So he writes the coolest job application letter in history. It's 11 paragraphs, and the first 10 are all about what he can do in engineering, in anatomy, in art, in science, in controlling the flows of waters and building castles. Only in the 11th paragraph at the end does he say, I can also paint as well as anyone. And so you see Leonardo loving everything in nature and just wanting to be, you know, a jack of all trades.
Is that his key quality, that he had this rapacious just hunger for everything?
Yeah, his key quality, what makes him a creative genius, I think, is that he was curious about everything. Sometimes it was a curiosity that could be useful, like he would dissect the neck and figure out how do I do St. Jerome in the wilderness. But then he'd keep dissecting, and he would dissect the heart and the liver, and he would do layered anatomical drawings. It was a curiosity that was passionate, that was playful, and ends up being curiosity for its own sake, which is what makes him feel the patterns of nature.
Right. This is something Nancy calls the gathering. You just gather everything up, and then it expresses itself in various different times in your life.
Some people who have written about Leonardo in the past century, they approach him as an art critic was, and they say, it's such a shame that he squandered so much time doing anatomy and the flight of birds and squaring the circle in mathematics. Otherwise, he could have finished more of those paintings. That's true. But he wouldn't have been Leonardo, and you wouldn't have had the Mona Lisa. It was that gathering of, and that's what we have to understand today, is that being curious about everything not only makes you more creative, it enriches your life.
And makes you a better dinner table conversationalist.
He would have been a great, you know, he would have been great at this table, sorry.
You mentioned St. Jerome. Is that the one, he went back to it later, right?
Yeah,
was that the one, he keeps working and
People
working?
say he abandons his paintings, but one of the things I discovered is like with St. Jerome, young painter in Florence, St. Jerome in the wilderness, very skeletal, because St. Jerome's in the wilderness. And he gets the neck muscles wrong early on, and puts the painting aside, gives it to Amerigo Vespucci's family, the guy who's about to go discover America. But he comes back 25 years later, after he's done more anatomy drawings, and he redoes the neck muscles. So I discovered it wasn't so much that he abandoned paintings. He thought Sometimes the perfect has to be the enemy of the good. There's always a brushstroke. I can make it better. And it reminded me of Steve Jobs, who holds up shipping the original Macintosh. I wrote a book about him earlier, and there's a lot of similarities because Steve wanted the circuit board inside the Mac to look beautiful. And so they hold up shipping it. And so that notion of sometimes you hold on to something until you can make it perfect. It's not a good recipe for business, but it is a good recipe to do every now and then in life.
The Mona Lisa. So explain why, because I think this touches on what you, but why is this such a great painting?
Yeah, you know, I think people come to it and you see huge crowds and you wonder, okay, you know, when you look at the Mona Lisa, it's the culmination of somebody who's spent a life looking at science, anatomy, geology, but also philosophy and spirituality. And so like even his early paintings, but culminating with the Mona Lisa, you have the river that curves from the ancient mountains and curves into the roads and then curves into the human body as our veins do. He always made an analogy between the earth and between us. So that's his fundamental philosophy. And just to give you one example of the science doing it, he had dissected the human eye and knew that the center of the retina is where you see black and white detail, but the edges of the retina you see shadows and color. And so over 16 years, he keeps painting the lips. He had dissected the human face and done every muscle and every nerve that touches the lips. But 16 years he's painting it, but he does the tiniest black and white details at the edge of the lips, going straight or turning down, but the shadows and colors turning up. So it becomes an interactive painting. Every time you see her, she seems to have a different emotion. Then you have a different emotion, your eyes change a bit, and the smile flickers back on. This is magical. It's showing inner emotion reflected on a face.
Last question, we have 30 seconds. You mentioned what he'd be like at a dinner party. What kind of a person was he?
He was very collegial, very friendly. He had everybody at the time, Luca Pacioli, the mathematician, Donato Bramante, they all refer to him as his best friend. And what he kind of does is he makes everybody feel that the way to be more creative is not to specialize, not to silo yourself as we sometimes do to our kids, but to be curious about everything for curiosity's sake.
Walter Isaacson, thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
And we'll be right back. And the CBS Evening News begins a new chapter next Monday, December 4th, when Jeff Glor takes over as the 9th anchor of the broadcast. Jeff, we wish you luck as you take on your new responsibilities. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Be sure to tune in to CBS This Morning tomorrow with Nora O'Donnell and Gail King. They will have some of our CBS affiliate WCCO-TV reporter and anchor Esme Murphy's interview with Al Franken. Esme has interviewed the center more than 100 times. This one will certainly be one we don't want to miss. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.